So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Colonel Retired David Gray, U.S. Army, also Dr. Colonel Gray. He, much like Paul Herbert, he has a PhD from The Ohio State University in military history. Yes. His present position is Director for the Center for Leadership and Ethics at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. Previous to that, he was served as a Director of Strategy and Campaigning at the Saudi War College in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. A longtime veteran of the U.S. Army, he commanded everything from platoon up to brigade combat team, primarily in light infantry or air assault units. His last command was the commander of 1st Brigade Combat Team, 101st Airborne Division up in Kirkuk in Iraq in 2005-2006. He also is a veteran of Afghanistan, and more applicable to today's talk is that he was a veteran of both Haiti and the Balkans. So he's going to be talking to us about what at the time was parochially called MOOTWA, or military operations other than war, which was a big issue and was a big factor for what the 1st Infantry Division and other elements of the U.S. military were doing in the 90s and kind of set the stage for post 9/11 military. So without further ado, David.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention today. I think we've had some great sessions, and I'm going to try and tie together many of the themes that you've already heard, and sort of in chronology, this presentation actually falls between our last two speakers, but they're going to complement each other if I get my job done right. Before I start, today's about missions. So let me thank you for your mission of educating our next generation of young men and women. As a fellow educator and as the father of another educator who's at 4th grade, you have a very important mission of preparing them for the world by critical thinking, looking at history not just as a bunch of facts, but something that's usable, something that they can draw out some insights that will help them analyze problems and make some good judgments. So I challenge you on that today as you go back to your schools. How can you use what you learn at this institute to challenge your students to think analytically and critically and use this information not just to pass the multiple choice test? Did I mention we have one of those before we go to the museum? Yeah. Not just to pass that, but something they can use to do their judgment. And I've talked to a couple of you about some ways that I do that back at Virginia Military Institute. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about military operations other than war. And Dr. Herbert kind of framed this out for us with the 1st Infantry Division today when he talked about that range of missions. And subsequent speakers have taken us through what we might call the full spectrum of the international environment, from deterrence to all-out high-intensity war. Well, I'm going to put us in somewhere in the middle, and hopefully we'll draw together some of those threads. This particular environment, I want you to keep a couple things in mind as broad themes as we go forward. Number one, what's has come out throughout the day has been this word adaption. How does a military adapt to the strategic situations it finds itself in, and how rapidly can they do that in the face of opposition, armed or not armed? Second, these operations that we're going to talk about are really political military operations very sensitive sometimes, that have ambiguous objectives that seem to change a lot over time. They have restrictions on use of force. Several of the speakers already talked about the rules of engagement. Those kind of shape how soldiers can respond on the ground. There are challenges to unity of effort. Now, we've talked mainly about our military services, but when you throw into that pot, our allies are operating on many of these operations. Our government throws certain agencies in the mix, and we don't always like to talk to each other for some reason. We're stovepipes. And then, of course, never forget the guy on the other side. His government, his people are key determinants of how your operation goes. So it's great to plan for things, but how do you adapt to what actually unfolds on the ground? And you've already got a flavor from several of the speakers. And then each of these operations that I'll talk about really fraught with some regional and global security implications. Sometimes small things lead to bigger challenges regionally or globally that come out of these conflicts. So we're putting a lot on the shoulders of our soldiers at junior levels to make very good judgments, well-informed judgments, so that it does not spiral out of control. So what I'd like to talk about is this military operations other than war. The intent is listed up there. We're going to focus on some peacekeeping and some peace enforcement missions and their implications going forward. To set the context, it's important to understand how we come out of Desert Storm, what is the strategic thinking and the policies that are going to shape when the Clinton administration gets in, what's their theory about keeping a global, stable environment, and then we'll talk about how these four missions fit into that. There are some key terms. Those are going to be on the quiz later on. Just kidding. That are important to understand, and certainly you can ask me about those as we go along. So, after about a decade and a half of hard work coming out of Vietnam, as General Scales has indicated, the United States military undergoes a renaissance. And it is those officers who came out of Vietnam and started to relook the military services, how to retrain, how to organize. But their orientation was from Vietnam and a counterinsurgency environment back to the highest of military professionalism, how to fight and win high-intensity war. And as you recall, that in the Cold War, our principal threat, the Soviet Union, we had made some economy of force measures. In other words, we kind of took some forces out of Europe to be able to put forces into Vietnam to fight that war, but the enemy was still there. Fortunately, deterrence was still working. But that reorientation, that renaissance, was focused on how, if deterrence fails, how can we fight and win a major war? And it's that renaissance that leads us into Desert Storm. Because we are successful in deterring a major war in Europe, partially out of those nuclear weapons, partially out of having great, well-trained conventional forces, and partially because of the political will and the determination to stay the course. At the end of as the Cold War ends, we become involved in Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And as indicated, a strategic choice is made once Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, a violation of international law, a nation state invading another nation state, and our nation decides to lead a coalition to respond to that. Desert Storm seemed to be, after the morass of Vietnam, a return to the good old American way of war that our fathers or grandfathers knew in World War II. Maybe a slog, maybe this was quick, decisive victory. It leveraged everything that General Scales had talked about and Greg Fontenot about those well-trained soldiers, high-tech equipment, prepared to fight, dedicated to a mission. And this looked great. The use of overwhelming force. There were clear objectives set forth by our national leaders. And it seemed like, at the time, a very quick victory, although Greg points out when you're actually deployed for several months, even before the fighting begins, it's not so quick for soldiers and Marines and airmen on the ground. But a quick victory followed by a quick withdrawal. That actually seemed to be foreshadowing the future. Despite those thoughts that this is an analogy, there were much in the professional publications about, maybe this is the way to fight. Decisive, overwhelming force, win quickly, and go home. But even before going home, even before all those troops had redeployed, there were glimmers that there was change on the horizon. So in the aftermath of the Gulf War, as forces drew down, the consequences of the war inside Iraq were that two of those ethnic factions that were dominant inside Iraq, the Kurds in the north and the Shia Arabs in the south, were looking, they were listening. They were listening to what we were saying. We were encouraging them to do something about Saddam Hussein because we had made the strategic choice. We weren't going to invade. We did not have the support of the coalition. So there was sort of this tacit understanding that if they did something internally, maybe the U.S. will come to our aid. And as all of these forces began to withdraw, the Kurds and the Shias in the south did in fact rise up. They're brutally suppressed by Saddam Hussein. And in that suppression, Saddam Hussein does resort to using some helicopters that we had probably mistakenly let him convince us that he needed to move his forces around, used it to begin to attack the civilian populations of these Kurdish and Shia. So, in northern Iraq, specifically, the Kurds begin basically a migration towards the mountains of Turkey, where they're going to establish sort of enclaves. They're really fleeing the violence. There's an international uproar over that, and inside our own government, we recognize that the Kurds, who had helped us, needed some protection. So the United States launches Operation Provide Comfort in northern Iraq to protect the Kurds fleeing towards Turkey. President Bush authorizes this operation really out of a humanitarian concern. There are strategic concerns, of course, because the Turks don't want and can't handle a large migration of refugees into its country. Moreover, they have their own problems with what they view as Kurdish terrorism on their territory. So the United States sort of balances these things, and President Bush authorizes Operation Provide Comfort. Now, in the humanitarian aspects, there is great suffering on the Kurd side. As they go into the mountains, they lack basic essentials: food, water, shelter. So that's one concern from the beginning, is to find humanitarian support. And so there are non-government agencies that begin to send supplies and people to help them, but they lack security. And that's the important part in the change of mission that begins with Operation Provide Comfort, that the military begins to perform. And that is to begin to provide security in something that's not war, but it's not peace. It's an operation other than war. And it involves some humanitarian aspects, but also some traditional military missions, security of its forces. So in Operation Provide Comfort, the military is going to get a small taste. Those forces that deployed from Europe are going to get a small taste of dealing with a refugee problem, dealing with a security problem, and dealing with how do you move people back into an area which they have fled, which is now devastated. Importantly, though, is the strategic thought behind this. And that is that President Bush, who's a realist in foreign policy, really, if you look at his term, tried to make good judgments from the perspective of what's in American national interest, actually opens the door to subsequent operations in terms of legal justification and in terms of putting American values above perhaps national interests. For this time, where George Bush had hesitated because of the coalition put together during Desert Storm and the strategic objectives of going into Iraq and overthrowing Saddam, that was not going to be an option. Not intervene in the internal affairs. Now with Provide Comfort, there's a little bit of room. Now we haven't intervened in the internal affairs of a country, which since 1648 in the international system had said sovereignty, a nation's sovereignty. What he did inside we could condemn, we could try and influence through diplomacy and other means, but sovereignty of nations was sacrosanct. And that was codified in international law. Now, because of humanitarian concerns, the idea that values and intervening on the behalf of people suffering from genocide or widespread repression may start in the post-Cold War world be more important. So Provide Comfort is sort of a first glimmer of the United States taking the lead in some instances to address humanitarian concerns in operations that perhaps the United States has no interest in, but its values are important in influencing the international system and hopefully stabilizing it. Now, from a military perspective, that's great. We want to be humanitarians, but what does it mean to me as a military man? Well, as a result of Provide Comfort, besides protecting the Kurds, supplying them, and eventually moving them back into their homes, it meant that the United States established no-fly and later no-drive zones over Iraq, over their sovereign territory. So in the north, as you can see depicted on the slide, that area in purple, and then in the south is a similar no-fly zone to protect the Shia Arabs. The United States deploys aircraft from Saudi Arabia, Joint Task Force Southwest Asia, and begins flying day after day. Its ostensible mission is to keep the Iraqis in the box, that area in between the lines, and to protect those peoples, Kurds and the Shia Arabs, from his repressive measures. It also gave us, quite frankly, sort of a trip line. We talked about that in Europe when we were talking deterrence. A trip line as we watched what Saddam would do inside Iraq to know whether he was going to try another invasion towards Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. So, no-fly zone. First, and Operation Provide Comfort are the first glimmers that maybe the military is going to have to focus on other areas, well prepared for high-end warfare and adaptable already to that warfare. Now it's going to take another step. So, in 1992, there's a changing of the guard. William J. Clinton is elected president, and there's a changing of the guard from George H.W. Bush, the realist in foreign policy, to the Vietnam generation represented by President Clinton. President Clinton and his key advisors are looking, and with a favorable view at times, to promoting American values. The theory, broadly speaking, behind the first national security strategy that President Clinton publishes in 1995, a national strategy of engagement and enlargement, is about addressing rogue states and ethnic conflict as two of the major threats. And to do that is to sustain a military force that are ready to fight and enforce the peace, and to promote democracy abroad. So, behind the national security strategy of engagement and enlargement is that notion of democratic peace, the expansion of market-based democracies which will spread those values and create stability in the world. Why stability in the world? Because the theory goes in various forms, but the theory, broadly speaking, is democracies don't fight democracies. Democracies represent their people's needs and who wants to go to war. So, spreading democracy in ways using the military suddenly became an option in certain areas. Now, President Clinton is not alone. Within the international community, there is a changing view towards this notion of national sovereignty. Whether or not nations who are in the position with the power and the capability should intervene in the internal affairs of a state that is abusing its people in terms of human rights, specifically if those human rights involve being killed through genocide or other means. So as these operations are going to unfold in the 1990s, the Clinton administration is going to look towards the United Nations for resolutions to help legitimize when force is used in some way to keep the peace in the world. Now, I've listed on this slide some of the relevant provisions in the United Nations Charter. We're pretty much a big architect of the UN Charter, and so when we look to use military force for other than things that were in our national interest, it became important for legitimacy's sake to look towards UN resolutions and get the whole team, the United Nations, on board with us to help. Now, this support for UN resolutions and support for what the UN calls humanitarian interventions really has some other key provisions behind it besides the Charter. Because of atrocities committed during World War II and elsewhere, there are other things that talk about values in the community of nations. The Universal Declaration of Rights, the conventions on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, just to name a couple. So those are all going to come into play as people start looking at what goes on in the four scenarios that we're going to talk about. Now, again, back to your military tasks. So, okay, coach, I want to get in the game, but I need to be prepared for the games that I'm going to play. And in that regard, virtually all of our speakers have talked about the role of doctrine, especially in the joint community, really all the services. We rely on doctrine, sort of our how to do things, what's behind the logic behind military operations. We rely on that doctrine to help guide us broadly when we go and commit our sons and daughters to an operation. So by 1995, the Joint Staff is going to produce a joint doctrine for military operations other than war. Now, Dr. Herbert put some of the principles up there, so I won't go back over those, except to mention probably three to keep in mind as we talk through each of these operations, beginning with Somalia. One is legitimacy. Legitimacy. Legitimacy is obtained through UN resolutions to act. The community of nations approves it. And then, of course, there are other resolutions in our Congress that are going to support some of this. Second is unity of effort. How to get everybody working towards common goals. That's a great buzz phrase, but for anyone who has been, whether it's peace operations or wartime, getting everybody on the same sheet of music, working together is a Herculean task. But it's important to keep in mind and to always work on that. And then third, and most troubling perhaps in the first stages of these operations, is this notion of restraint. So instead of decisive, overwhelming force, it's now less than force. Lesser is better, because restraint in the struggles among the people that General Scales referred to is all important, so that you don't make the situation worse than it already is by the time you intervene. So let's briefly cover 4 operations that fall in the 1990s under this rubric of military operations other than war. And they all fall within the peace enforcement meaning we're going to go into a country fully prepared to fight to enforce the provisions of these UN resolutions if need be, and as they transition to peacekeeping operations, where actually all parties involved actually consent to admitting peacekeepers into the country to stabilize the situation and recognize the rules. So we're going to look at 4 case studies this afternoon. The first is Somalia and Operation Restore Hope. This operation begins largely because of a famine that occurs, long-term famine and drought in the Horn of Africa, specifically in the country of Somalia. This leads to widespread suffering. The suffering is publicized widely on the new 24/7 press outlets. So pictures of young babies, starving babies, babies with distended stomachs, with flies on their face, suddenly began to cover a lot of coverage. Now, part of that, all good, because it was meant to engage the international community to try and help those poor souls. Unfortunately for the Somali people, they were divided by ethnic clans, each clan trying to steal each other's limited food and water. Each warlord of those clans vying for power inside of Somalia. So, by August of 1992, the UN is going to pass a resolution, Resolution 751, which is going to authorize the formation of United Nations operations in Somalia and call for member nations to form a small peacekeeping force that can go assist the plethora of non-governmental agencies, relief agencies from around the world that are actually trying to deliver food and supplies to the Somali people. Unfortunately, the warlords, in order to secure the movement of any supplies, begin to extort all of the agencies for protection money. The general mentioned about technicals, mounting weapons on the back of Toyota trucks, and gang behavior by those technical gangs to loot and raid food supplies became commonplace. The small peacekeeping force that was deployed under UNISOM proves inadequate. In December of 1992, on his way out of office, President Bush authorizes Operation Restore Hope. It was supposed to be a very short-term mission, deploy sufficient forces to secure the food supply, to assist in those delivery of food, stabilize the situation, and continue then to hand it back off to the United Nations and go from there. Now, as you look at the map, interestingly, the operation evolves in 3 phases. Really brings in a Marine Expeditionary Unit, brings in the 5th Special Force, Army 5th Special Forces, brings in Navy SEALs, and brings in a brigade from the 10th Mountain Division. And they initially secure the major cities, and relief supplies begin to flow in. As those cities begin to be stabilized, because, hey, the warlords are a little bit cowed, intimidated by all those American forces coming in. So we gain a little bit of moral ascendancy for a while to allow the delivery of those humanitarian supplies. The last 2 phases of the operation go to expanding out into the countryside. get the food out into the smaller villages so that they too can survive. And so after about 6 months or so, really there is some success, and the American forces begin to draw down and hand it back over to the UN, which calls for some more member states to bring peacekeeping forces in. But again, the warlords get the upper hand, and the UN forces, with only a small number of American forces left in, begin to founder. Now, the American chain of command, there are recommendations of how to fix the situation. What the decision that is finally made is to send a special operations task force ranger, to begin now to take out what is perceived to be the problem. The problem is some of these key warlords, Mohammed Adid being the main one, to try and capture them and bring about a negotiated settlement with the warlords. But we decided to use the special operations, our precision weapon, to carry out a series of raids within Somalia to get after Adid and his lieutenants and other clan members who are involved in this. Task Force Ranger makes 6 successful raids. On its 7th raid inside Mogadishu on the 3rd of October, they meet concerted resistance. General Scales mentioned the book Black Hawk Down. I'd commend that if you're going to study Somalia from a high school student perspective, an excellent read, and gives you an idea of what our soldiers faced and what the problems are in these type of operations. But Black Hawk Down occurs because as they go for a raid, they're met by some of Adin's technicals who mobilize crowds. There tries to be an extraction of American forces. A helicopter is shot down. One of the helicopters from the Special Operations Forces, they can see that one of the pilots is still alive, and 2 American special operators decide, with permission of General Gary Harrell, who was in command of the operation that day, to fast rope down and try and rescue the pilot. Of course, they knew the chances of their survival and rescue were very slim. But they wanted to try on a demonstration of our values, never leave a comrade behind. Shugart and Gordon, Master Sergeants Shugart and Gordon, are killed in that raid. They'll later earn the Medal of Honor. Task Force Ranger is pinned down for about 24 hours before a heavily armored convoy is able to break through the city under heavy fire and extract the Rangers and the other special operators. President Clinton and his team reinforce with some armor and some other forces into Somalia, but the game is really up. Within 6 weeks, American forces begin to withdraw. What's the turning point? General Scales hit on it. When the American public saw video of dead American pilots being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu and cheering crowds watching that, there was an uproar. There was an uproar not only in the public opinion, but also an uproar in Congress, which voted to, hey, we need to bring our guys home. We have no national interest, so we need to bring our guys home. So shortly after, within 3 months or so, all American forces are going to be withdrawn from Somalia. So our excursion into Somalia started out with humanitarian concerns, evolves into security concerns, evolves into what infamously became known as mission creep. That is, now we got to start going out and manhunt the warlords to try and solve the problem. And by the way, we're trying to settle this and help Somalia build up some kind of stable institutions to help their people. All of that ends pretty much in a disaster. So it's with Somalia in the back of their minds that subsequent operations are going to stress, phrase used repeatedly today, force protection. Commit American forces for our values or our interests, but the lesson drawn out of Somalia was the American public, will support them as long as we have low or no casualties, if it's not in our national interest. So, the next operation, soon after, is Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti. In 1991, a military junta overthrew the man to your right, duly elected President Aristide, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and he was thrown off the island and the military junta took over. So for 4 years, that junta is going to rule the island in a very repressive manner. Finally, what happens is the Haitian people get sick of it, and they start looking for any type of little boat, little raft, whatever they can put together to get off that island. And they're all heading towards Florida. So there's a large refugee migration trying to escape this poverty, this repression by the junta. So finally, in July of 1994, as several of these waves of refugees are turned back, picked up, turned back, brought back to Haiti, President Clinton authorizes the deployment of a multinational joint task force to restore order. He's going to be backed by another UN resolution and support from the Organization of American States. So he has legitimacy. He's forging a joint task force around the 18th Airborne Corps out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is going to plan 2 types of operations. One, if it's opposed, or one for permissive entry, meaning, hey, we can negotiate with the junta, they're going to allow us then to get on board. So for the troops, on one hand, they're thinking, I may have to do a little bit of fighting. On the other hand, when it's over, because Haiti just really has a police force, not any real military power, I'm going to have to do some other missions. I'm going to have to do patrols on the streets. I'm going to have to engage local leaders. So all of that in the preparation for how to deal with an intervention. Now, that, that task force actually gets in the air on the 19th of September, 1994. The 82nd Airborne Division parachutes on, on in the plane, 5th Special Forces Group, the Rangers are all in the air when at the 11th hour, literally, they're turned back. They're turned back because of a diplomatic mission headed by former President Carter, Colin Powell, and Senator Sam Nunn, who are able to convince the head of the junta, General Cedras, that this would not be a good thing for him or his regime, and it would be better if he stepped down. And in fact, he does. So the assault forces are turned back, and other forces from the 10th Mountain, the 5th Special Forces Group, and the Marines actually make an unopposed entry, and they spread out onto the island of Hispaniola, the country of Haiti. And up on the map, the centers of the effort for the soldiers start in the cities. And really, it's to maintain the peace and security in the cities. A difficult task. I remember my first night coming off the plane onto shore, getting in the back of a Humvee and riding up to the presidential palace, which is my particular task force was to provide security at the National Palace and for President Aristide until a police force that could guard him was stood up. I remember driving through in some of the most pitch black environment I've ever been in, see a little fire at the end of the street. That's all I can see. Till we get up to the fire, and there are several people huddled along the fire. There are 4 or 5 bodies over near the fire, and there's a large crowd that are beating up on a woman, and there are several machetes out by these gang members threatening the civilians. So that was the first introduction of this is going to be a difficult environment for soldiers. But there were very restrictive ROE, rules of engagement, for how to deal with that. And really, it was to take charge. And I think our soldiers did a great job of being able to react to these acts of violence without necessarily, I don't think we ever fired a shot because we were able to control the situation. So this particular operation went on for 6 months. Variety of forces rotated in for that 6 months, stabilized the situation, and was able to hand it over to a UN-sponsored task force headed by an American general, Lieutenant General Joseph Kinzer. Now, second anecdote I want to share with you because it kind of underscores public support. So one night, there was a break-in to a home. It was an upper-class home. And the wife of this upper-class man was killed in a robbery. That was the single act of violence that occurred in Haiti that night, recorded act. That act made it on to the New York Times, which lambasted the task force for, hey, Haiti is out of control. So it kind of gives you some flavor for a sense of perspective. Oh, by the way, that night in New York City alone, there were 28 murders. In Chicago, there were 15. So having a sense of perception and perspective is very important because people are looking at how do you measure success and when can you relieve. So in March 1995, after about 6 months on the ground, American forces are going to handle it over. Is Haiti any better off today after that intervention? Well, Aristide lasted a couple years, was later left, was unelected. Other candidates have been in there, but it still has security problems. The next intervention, again, these are all coming back to back in time, in the time frame. So as you look at them, you've gone from Somalia, drawn some lessons there. You've gone into Haiti, you're drawing some lessons there. Now the next big one is the Balkans, and Bosnia in specific. So I don't need to recite all that. You know that when Tito dies, Yugoslavia begins to break up into a series of separate republics. In 1992, Bosnia-Herzegovina is one of those provinces that begins to break away, but there's an internal dispute within this particular province between the three ethnic factions, the Bosniaks, the Serbs, and the Croats. The Bosniaks are the majority at about 44%. The Serbs are about 33% of the population. The Croats are about 17%. Now, an interesting thing, and Colonel Fontenot has already talked about, since he was one of the first brigades on the ground, is that some of these factions, in some of the areas, these factions had been coexisting peacefully. At least they weren't killing each other. That didn't mean the hatred was not underneath the surface. But it breaks up when the Serbs object to being in a country with a Bosniak majority, and so they revolt. And so for 2 years, there is going to be what we called ethnic cleansing that occurs throughout Bosnia as the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims vie for position and political power. Forced migrations, genocide, repression all take place, really on all sides, but really high end on the Serb side. The UN does authorize a protective force in 1992, and the Europeans play in that. But this force is trying to intervene to bring peace. It's not enforcing the peace, it's trying to stabilize the situation. But it doesn't have the authorities to really get in between these warring factions. So it begins to break down. From the United States side, we support this UNPROFOR mission largely through naval power. There's a naval task force that's put out into the Adriatic Sea to stop weapons from going into Bosnia. We provide trainers to the Croatian army, and ultimately in 1995, as there's a siege around Sarajevo and as the Serbs continue ethnic cleansing, the United States commits its Air Force in an operation called Deliberate Force. And Deliberate Force, in conjunction with a Croatian offensive, is actually going to move the Serbs back. They lose a lot of territory. Ultimately, it's going to help bring the parties to the negotiating table at Dayton. So, here's really the conundrum, as exemplified by this famous story and debate for what the United States should do and in what level of force we should go into Bosnia. And it's really this exchange between Madeleine Albright and Colin Powell that occurs before we decide what to go into. And that conundrum goes to, what's the point of having the superb military? Because if you're not going to use it, because there were a lot of arguments not to go into Bosnia. Colin Powell said, overwhelming force. That's the lesson. That's the way you can control the situation. His reasoning. So, we are going to conduct, as Colonel Fontenot said, I-4 will go into Bosnia, cross the Savo River, and we'll assume some zones of action and begin to conduct a series of operations. Shown a few slides, pictures up here. Force protection, fortified base camps. This base camp, Colonel Fontenot and I shared, Camp McGovern. surrounded by mines, lots of effort put into demining, lots of effort to keep the factions from fighting when large crowds came together, weapons collection efforts called Harvest, conducted by our soldiers. Interestingly, how do you communicate with the population? Through radio, primarily, and interviews with local press, a daunting task if you've never done it. And as Colonel Fontenot said, if you can't speak their language, you're dependent upon your interpreter and hope they get it right for what you're saying. And then working with the armed forces, each of the entities, to train them and help professionalize them. Now, the idea in I-4 and later on as rotations go, the stabilization force was go in heavy and build down. So maybe that kind of goes to our discussion about escalate to de-escalate. As things stabilize, you can begin to bring your forces down. Similar circumstance happens in 1999 when, and this time in Kosovo, the province at the bottom corner of the map that you can see, Kosovo is sacred ground for the Serbs, going back to 1389. And Kosovo province, famous battle, the Battle of Kosovo Pali, is something that they hold great national pride, which is interesting because in that battle, their prince is killed and their army loses the battle and is dispersed by the Ottoman Turks. So they hold dear a battle which they lost. The symbolism is it's an example of martyrdom for Serb nationalism. So, as this province slowly through migration turns from a Serbian province to a Kosovo Albanian province in terms of its ethnic composition, repression occurs. Now, the United States is going to get involved, the international community is going to get involved, quite frankly, because of the ethnic cleansing by the Serbs in Kosovo process. We launch Operation Allied Force, which is really a NATO air campaign to bring the Serbs to the table. After 78 days of bombing, mainly strategic targets, infrastructure targets, and some ground forces, were able to get Slobodan Milosevic to come to the table and agree to step down. There's several good debates in the literature and at the time between how to bring about the peace. Was it through the air campaign or was it the threat of ground force? Ultimately, it is the ground force that goes in after Milosevic agrees to a ceasefire, and it is that ground force, KFOR, that is going to enforce the peace, doing all those missions that we talked about from Somalia, Haiti, and Bosnia. Lots of presence patrols. So, in summary, what's the so what? The so what is during the 1990s, for the United States military, well-trained, highly disciplined, a volunteer force showed immeasurable adaptability to situations initially, they weren't prepared for, but they adapted pretty well. And instead of applying force, they were able to use restraint and bring about some level of security and stability in each of these countries. Last, these operations had a great impact on junior leaders because they operated independently and had to use their judgment in these situations. All of these were skills that we would need and apply again in Afghanistan and Iraq. So thank you very much, and if there's time for questions, I'm open to a couple.
Thanks very much, Colonel Gray, for a very thorough exposition of humanitarian assistance operations. We have 15 minutes for questions, so who would like to begin? I see we have, Jessica? Yep.
Hi, Ellen Resnick, Downingtown East High School, Downingtown, Pennsylvania. I'm wondering if you can comment kind of in a general sense on the lessons that we learned from these 4 operations and the response to the current humanitarian crises today.
That's a great question. So I want to start with, it does help if you can get some level of guidance about what the strategic objectives are that you want to obtain. Now, as those who study war know, starting out with an end state, a perceived end state, and strategic goals usually evolves during the war. But in these particular operations, they started out with, hey, stop the killing and provide humanitarian support to the people and go home. But over time, they evolved to hunting down warlords. They evolved to that term that is sort of in disrepute today, nation building. How do we build institutions for long-term stability? Because we have a tendency, as the general said, to want to build them in our image. But how do we get some kind of institution that's stable so that we don't have to keep coming back every 6 months? And so some clarity on just what's expected. To be honest with you, that's a tough row to hoe. I think the most important thing out of this is, back to the discussion that we've had this entire day, is it gives our military forces some opportunity to empathize in a different environment, in a different culture, so that they can understand the situation better and adapt. It takes some flexibility to be able to operate in that. That's intellectual. That's something we have to develop. We can teach somebody how to do a battle drill out of the back of a Bradley fighting vehicle or an infantry battlefield patrol. We can teach that and what to do if you take fire, and it's almost muscle memory. But dealing with somebody killing a woman on the side of the road and nobody seems to care, that's pretty scary stuff. And junior leaders have to understand what they are authorized to do and not authorized to do and take action. Does that answer your question? Great, thanks.
Mike Anderson?
Sir.
Hey.
Sir, Mike Anderson, Orange County Department of Ed, Orange, California.
Yeah.
I served in Kosovo in 2005 and 6, and at that time we were specifically forbidden to discuss Kosovo as a country, and we were not to mention, we were never to use that word, etc. Now that Kosovo is gaining more recognition, more or less, on the international stage, where do you see that situation going, especially with the reintegration of alleged former war criminals into their government, such as Haradinaj?
Yeah, you might say that the Kosovars conducted a highly effective insurgency, right? Really, they got, after suffering, there's no question about that, they really got us to do a lot of the heavy lifting for them, and very rapidly. I think it was 5 years after things stabilized that they were able to declare themselves as a country. I don't see us really. It's passed over to the Europeans now, who are in there. I think the Europeans do put great stock in trying to get the war criminals and bring them to justice in the international court, but I don't think you'll see any, unless there was widespread ethnic cleansing again. I think the Kosovars they got what they got, and we'll move on from there. I think there'll still be friction between Serbia and Kosovo for sure. Does that answer your question? It's an opinion.
Richard Vandenbosch, right over here behind you.
Richard Vandenbosch, Modesto, California. I'm interested in this whole idea of humanitarian aid, and why is it that, because at the same time, of course, we have atrocities going on, like in Rwanda, where you got 500,000 people, conservative estimates, that were killed. To what degree was a discussion in the works of possibly intervening in a place like this? I mean, it seems that, you use an example of a woman in Haiti. It seems like there is massive atrocities, and does that speak a little bit to the Eurocentrism of perhaps American policy?
So Rwanda happens closely behind Somalia. And you have President Clinton was only in office for a year, and of course got taken to the woodshed politically about Somalia, even though casualties really not that high. 18 are killed in Mogadishu. There are a few more. But I think there was a reluctance to intervene so close after that. President Clinton also is on the record of saying that if he had to do it over again, that was one that he probably would have taken a more active role and intervened. So I think there is some, as you say, where do you focus on in these things? They're happening all over the world, ladies and gentlemen. So the strategic issue is, if you're going to intervene on value's sake, does that mean we have to intervene all over the world for every circumstance and be the global policeman, or do we need to be discreet? That's sort of the strategic calculation. But clearly, coming into office, there was a thought that we could be a little more proactive and spread democracy around the world. Maybe we've learned, as General Scales said, that that doesn't work out all the time like you'd like it. Does that answer your question? Great. Other questions?
Is that Ginny Muse?
Ginny Muse, Mount Sterling, Kentucky. I think you've already kind of answered this, but I know currently, at least for my students, I have a global issues class, but the issue in Myanmar with the Rohingya people is something that they're constantly bringing up. And I was wondering, what would be the best way to kind of explain to them, or at what point would we intervene? Or I know you've kind of touched on that a little bit, but what do you think would need to happen in order for us to deem that as something that was important enough to get involved in?
Yeah, I think, and I may kick this one over to the general if he's willing to help me answer this one. I think, again, it goes back to a calculation that our National Security Council, President, DOD, and others, all those calculations are balancing national interest with the promotion of values, with the resources available, and where does that fit in the strategy. So I'd say first and foremost, I would not see us necessarily intervening unless there was a big push from the United Nations and there were other partners that were willing to go in. And then perhaps the United States would provide what we do best, which might be logistical support and other things. But I think it's back to that notion of legitimacy and unity of effort. And right now, I don't think there's a consensus for that. Sir? Thank you, sir. Other questions?
We'll take one more question right in the center there. Oh.
Yeah. The question is really about terms of national sovereignty and really about command structure, where do we fit in and what authorities do we have, and about rules of engagement. So let me try and address those. In terms of national sovereignty, depending upon what the mission is and how it's organized to be on the ground, nations are going to retain. You don't give up your sovereignty. Most nations are going to have to report back to their own country and get guidance about certain strategic issues. Commanders get some level of authorities delegated to them. And that's going to change. That's going to be mission to mission. So national sovereignty, even under a United Nations mission, is still there. But you are agreeing when a UN mission is out there, you are agreeing to some common objectives, some common goals, and some common rules, which are largely set up to help protect the force, that would be the UN forces, and to protect the people that you're going in to intervene. Every country also sets its own rules of engagement on how to do those. So if our hands are tied behind our back, that's largely because up the chain and down the chain of command, they've determined here are certain strictures we need for restraint and legitimacy and unity of effort. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
More or less. I haven't convinced you.
And the only reason I brought that up was in Somalia, they were not allowed to have their weapons locked and loaded, and they were told to refrain from using any type of force.
So, again, it evolved over time. So when we first went in, it was really as trying to just maintain security. As the warlords created more violence, the rules of engagement change. So rules of engagement are those things that you really don't want to talk about with the American public, because then, just like anything else, it gets on CNN and bad guys are watching that. Okay? So there is prudence in setting rules of engagement. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.